Hello, everyone, and welcome to LSE for this evening's hybrid event hosted by the LSE European Institute. My name is Marta Larmer, and I'm a fellow in European politics at the European Institute. I'm very pleased to be joined here today by Richard Bellamy, Gerard Delanty, Kimberly Hutchins, Anne Phillips, and Jonathan White. So I'll properly introduce our speakers shortly, but before I do so, I would like to ask those of you in the auditorium to please put your phones on silent. This event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast subject to no technical difficulties. As usual, there will be a chance for you to put your questions to our speakers. For the online audience, you can submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please include your name and affiliation. And for those of you in the auditorium, I'll let you know when we're open the floor for questions. For those of you who are on X, formerly known as Twitter, the hashtag for today's event is LSEEI. So about 10 years ago, I started writing a master's dissertation here at the European Institute. And I very clearly remember one of our teachers telling us that when you're writing a dissertation, you're not supposed to write about the future. That we leave to policymakers. So I was quite surprised when a few years later, I found that there's an entire field dedicated to the study of the future and that you could actually write books about it. And today we're here to discuss two of these books. We'll be discussing Jonathan White's In the Long Run, The Future as a Political Idea, and Gerard Delanty's Senses of the Future, Conflicting Ideas of the Future in the World Today. Both books, I think, are really important in an age where the future seems to be moving further out of sight and act as powerful reminders of why we should, if we are invested in democratic politics, think and care about the future and look at it with a spirit of hope. So without further ado, we're going to start this discussion. We'll hear first from Jonathan and from Gerard. So Jonathan White is Professor of Politics at the LSE European Institute, and Gerard Delanty is Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Social and Political Thought at Sussex University. So they will have about 10 minutes to present their books, and then we'll hear from our discussants who will have a chance to respond to the book's arguments. So our discussants today are Anne Phillips, Kimberly Hitchings, and Richard Bellamy. Anne Phillips is Professor Emerita at LSE, where she was previously Graham Wallace Professor of Political Science. Kimberly Hutchins is Professor of Politics NIR at Queen Mary University of London. And Richard Bellamy is Professor of Political Science at University College London and a Senior Fellow at the Hertie School. So Gerard and Jonathan will then have a chance to respond to their comments, and then we'll open up for the Q&A with the audience. So Jonathan, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me well. Thanks for coming to this, and it's a great pleasure to start the discussion today on this theme of the politics of the future, and to talk for just a few minutes about my own part of this, which is this book that Marta just referred to called In the Long Run, The Future as a Political Idea. You can see a copy that Richard has got on his lap there. It's a book about how ideas of the future make their way into politics, how the future is used, how it's abused in politics, and in particular, what this might all imply for democratic politics. As that cover shows, it's a book that has a tortoise on the cover of it, and I think the presence of that little figure is somewhat suggestive of the issues that I'm getting at, because of course we often think of the tortoise going back to ancient fables as a symbol of a certain way of approaching time and a certain way of answering questions of how much time do we have. And of course, in stories, the tortoise and the hare, the tortoise's answer is very much that we have plenty of time, or at least time enough to show certain types of virtues of perseverance, of deliberation, and care. Hasten slowly, as the famous maxim has it. And this is a book which tries to run with similar themes as they might apply in the political domain. In other words, to think about the ways in which how much time we have available to us is a recurring theme in politics, and in particular, how answers to that might vary across time in place. How much time do we have to tackle problems, to make progress, to correct injustices, or simply to survive? As I try to argue in the book, you can see different types of answer to this with different ways of thinking about the future attached to them, from the immediacy of the 18th century revolutions in Europe, in France, America, and reverberating beyond, to a sense of a very spacious future, the indefinite future of the 19th century, the early 20th century. It is, of course, interesting that the Fabians, that political movement so closely associated with LSE, come to adopt the tortoise as their logo, and with it to embrace an ethos of gradualism. But of course, always courting the risk that comes with this idea of the very spacious, abundant future, courting the risk that the long view is something that can weaken radicalism, that can create a sort of luxurious, overly incremental way of doing politics. And so perhaps it's no surprise that the motto that goes with this Fabian tortoise is, "When I strike hard," as though to ward off the fear that perhaps they never strike at all. So from the immediacy of the revolutions of the modern period to the gradualism, the indefinite future of certain forms of social democracy and beyond in the 19th, 20th century, and perhaps to something that today looks rather different, where for many people, perhaps it's exactly the sense of the absent future, of temporal claustrophobia, of a future closing in on the present, that perhaps marks so many of the fears which are present in contemporary politics. As this book tries to show, democratic politics is about reconciling these demands of the near future, the far future, as well as a range of other dichotomies that the book goes into over the course of its chapters. I would think of this as, if you like, a historically informed work of political theory. And it's not so much about the future as such, perhaps as you can see the way I'm developing these ideas, but how ideas of the future make their way into democracy, how democracy is shaped by hopes, fears, and expectations. As I try to make clear in the book, ideas of the future offer something distinctive in politics. They offer perspective on the present, something you see already in utopian thought as it emerges in the 17th, 18th century as a way of taking distance on the present. I think ideas of the future offer the basis for forms of shared identity, for the making of collectives, ideas of shared fate, ways in which strangers can find common cause in politics. Think of the isms, the manifestos of ideological party politics from the 19th century onwards. And of course, you might say that ideas of the future don't just offer those things, but they offer reason for commitment, reason to stick with projects in adversity, where of course the danger, as one perhaps starts to lose sense of that longer term, is precisely that things have to be resolved in the present. There can be no confidence of a longer time space in which things can be pursued. Partisanship as the enduring cause that can outlive the individual perhaps comes especially under strain under those conditions. And as I also try to argue in this book, democracy itself has perhaps a particular relationship to ideas of the future. If modern democracy is representative democracy, then it's a form of democracy that is based on mediating institutions, conflicts between majorities and minorities, and all the challenges that arise with exclusions due to the difficulty of representing everything at once. How is legitimacy built for this kind of system? Well, if it is built at all, then it perhaps is built on the idea of the availability of the future. Losers' consent, as the political scientists call it, the reason to accept election defeats that go against you, are somehow founded in the idea of a next time, a future of rectification, a future in which the problems of particular institutions, particular electoral outcomes, particular defeats can somehow be addressed. And of course, today, as I foreshadowed before, it's perhaps exactly this sense of the available future which is increasingly questioned in an age of emergencies to do with climate change, to do with economic inequality, geopolitics, and so much more. An age of emergencies that perhaps both reflects that loss of confidence in the future. Things become an emergency when you doubt the capacity for sustained intervention and want to resolve things in the now, but also emergencies that reinforce that sense of temporal claustrophobia, presenting volatility in a reactive form of politics, reactive to external constraints. So to draw things together, of course, we may be familiar increasingly perhaps with critiques of short-termism in politics. It has almost the ring of common sense that we critique our leaders for being short-termist and perhaps being embroiled in exactly these emergencies of the present and doing so little to overcome them because their focus is perhaps a presentist one or a focus on the near future. I think one of the guiding thoughts of this book is that these critiques of short-termism often miss their mark. They often present this either as a problem of psychology, that we need to somehow lift our eyes and think a little bit further into the future, or they present them as problems of culture, perhaps that postmodern societies are somehow intrinsically unable, constitutively unable to take a longer-term perspective on politics. And as I try to bring through in this book, I think very much at the heart of this is politics and the health of political organizations, institutions, things that can give confidence in the longer view, or conversely, in moments of ailing, can remove that confidence. So it's collectives oriented to a politics of ideas, whether we're talking about parties, movements, that can build a sense of shared fate and agency, reason to trust that defeats are not final defeats. An electoral outcome is perhaps not the end of the matter, but there is always something further to be pursued. That's why this book, having gone through many discussions about different concepts of the future historically and into the present, then comes to think about the ways in which exactly these political organizations, which can be the source of confidence in the future or fail to give any reason for confidence in the future, might be reformed so as to give them something more of that politics of ideas, of causes about them. So the maxim being, I guess, don't just think long-term, but organize for it. But the book's key message, I guess, is a more general one. To understand politics, the health of democracy, we need to look not just at how people evaluate the present, but where they hope and fear that things may be heading.
Great. So Gerard, if you want to go now.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I get myself wired up first, I think.
Yes.
Thanks. Okay, good evening, everyone. Well, like many academics, I spent much of my life reading about the past, the influence of the past on the present, without thinking too much about what this all meant for the future. And I must admit, I never had any real perspective on future ideas, thinking, reading, writing about the influence of the past. But my way into this book was the realization that the past itself is made up of future ideas and failed, in many cases, failed future ideas. And that then raises the question of how we see the relationship of the present to the future. But let me go straight to the core argument of my book and try to clarify the key idea that I try to develop in the course of this book. It's about a contemporary and historical perspective on future ideas. So my main argument is that there's a major shift in the idea, in the thinking, the concept of the future today in contemporary societies. So the idea of the future, and I try to explain this a little bit more shortly, the idea of the future is essentially first and foremost an idea. It is a concept. It's a way of seeing the world. It's a a way of making sense of the world. It's a prism through which people view their historical present. It can be seen as a category of historical interpretation. I hope everyone can understand me. I'm struggling today with the aftermath of a cold. Please indicate if I should speak up more. Now, the major crises of the present, however you want to describe them, obviously the climate crisis, war, political authoritarianism, economic crisis today, all shape how we think about the future. But a key feature of future ideas today, of thinking about the future, is that it's pervaded by uncertainty and unpredictability. That's now really very central to the idea of the future. I argue that the way the future is now seen represents actually a rupture from older conceptions of the future. Modern ideas of the future have really come to an end today. And the future is itself a modern idea. Of course, it had pre-modern antecedents. It was, of course, a feature of classical and medieval thought. But, to characterize this, perhaps one could say the figure of Cassandra characterized pre-modern ideas of the future. Cassandra foresaw the fall of Troy and her own death, but of course could do nothing about it. Now that was quite a contrast to modern ideas, let's say from the 18th century onwards, because the modern idea of the future was that it was the promise of a better world, and that it could be known, and that it could be mastered. Now, in my book, I discuss three historical narratives that mostly emerged, you can argue, when the Renaissance Enlightenment period. First and foremost, the idea of progress. Of course, that was the most important modern one, much associated with Kant, but also Condorcet, as a counter narrative to that, where ideas of utopia, there were of course many ones, and they changed over time. They became increasingly important. And thirdly, the prophetic tradition that was especially a feature of Romantic thought and prevalent especially in English Romanticism. I have a picture in the front cover of my book of the famous Last Man painting by John Martin can we just, they can't see it, but anyway, it's one of my favorite photographs. I was very happy when the Walker Gallery of Liverpool allowed me to use this beautiful painting, because of course it has relevance for the present day with the theme of the end of times and catastrophe. Yeah, so these were the main historical narratives, and they were all imaginaries. They're all based on different imaginaries, and they competed with each other, which in many different ways. Now, to jump much ahead, postmodern thought, I argue, effectively intellectually killed the idea of the future, above all the utopian idea, because postmodern thought, especially in the writings of Foucault, turned attention to the past that had to be deconstructed. And the whole idea of the future was regarded as an illusion of modernity, and that too was the case with Lyotard. I realize that Derrida's project was a very different one, but that's too complicated to go into. But overall, the postmodern movement turns attention to the past, to the deconstruction of the past, and had little to say on the future. The modern idea of the future really came to a final end, I suppose we could say, with the arrival of the Anthropocene. So the future is now generally agreed with the great acceleration in the period after the Second World War. And, well, maybe to make another generalization, the historical experience of the middle of the 20th century perhaps was another writing off of the relevance of the idea of the future. And, well, I think especially what came out of postmodernism was a pervasive presentism, the idea that there's only an endless present, but no future. Now, I discuss in the book new narratives of the future, new theories, new writings, new concepts, new ideas. For example, well, I suppose it must be the prevalent one today, the theme of dystopia, broadly the perspective on catastrophe, the end of times, to the spectre of the possible end of humanity itself, and then the whole idea of deep adaptation, the idea that there is no future, that all we can do is adapt to the circumstances that humanity finds itself in, and there can only be, in essence, only grief over the loss of future. So there's that. There's even anti-natalism, the idea that it's best for there to be no more humans, an idea that possibly even goes back to the writings of Schopenhauer. And there are sinister movements that do try to rekindle or offer a new understanding of the future, which I call techno-optimism, techno-utopianism. The idea that a new future can be delivered through technology, as in, for example, climate engineering, space travel. And that's connected with certain currents in post-humanism. I know post-humanism is a more complicated movement, but there is an influential, depoliticized post-humanism prevalent in contemporary thought. The idea that humans can evolve eventually into future humans through technology. And this brings me to a related, very influential theory of the future today, especially in the Institute of the Future of Humanity in Oxford, the concern with the long term, so-called long-termism. The philosophical idea, the philosophical foundation of this quite influential movement goes back to the writings of the enigmatic philosopher Derek Parfit, who in the 1980s wrote a famous book, Persons and Reason, basically the argument being that our obligations to future people, future persons, are as great as our obligations to those now living. And that presents all kinds of problems, philosophical problems about our commitment to the present. It means effectively to a break of the idea of the future from the present and the past, with a concern with the long-term survival of humanity 200,000 years from now. So what I try to do is identify some of these debates and state my position in relation to them, and to identify counter trends. For example, there is clearly a desire for an alternative today, something new, as in the revival of utopianism, and also critical dystopianism, because a good deal of literature on dystopianism is critical dystopianism. It is seeking a kind of utopianism, and utopians tend to see dystopia everywhere. Now, there are, of course, many other debates, the question of the temporality of the future, but specifically the concern of Jonathan's book, the whole problem of, what is the future? Is it to be thought in terms of a generation? Normally in sociology, that's about 30 years. Is it to be considered in terms of a life, maybe 100 years? Future humans in 200,000 years, what evolution might eventually produce, which will probably take another 50,000 years for evolutionary changes in humans to be discernible. Multiple temporalities, the relationship between the geological history of the planet, so planetary history, life, not just human life, but the history of life, biological life, and human history, the interaction of these. The question of how open is the future in sociology. There's a real big interest in the future today, but there's also perhaps too much confidence that the future can be shaped by human agency. And there are counter debates. So, for example, the Luhmannian idea of the unknowability of the future is an important corrective to many of these notions of the open future. and the problem that I previously mentioned of uncertainty. So for sure, the future is not determined. It's not a question of is it determined or is it not, but how open is it? And that relates to the problem of knowability and the problem of uncertainty. How much does the past offer as a guide? I have a whole chapter on that. And I guess I'm making the point that we've probably reached the point today that the past offers less a guide for the present. Is catastrophe the only way to see the future? I argue that we need to move beyond catastrophe thinking. I also try to make links. It's a very challenging thing to do with the idea of the future in relation to notions of the future in physics, the related notions of time, because of course the future is in part a temporal concept, relating concepts of time in above all in the natural sciences, especially physics and biology, to the social and human sciences. But enough of that to be a little bit more concrete and to offer some guide as to what it means to speak of the future. We need a theory of it. We need to clarify what we mean by the future. And I try to do that in the book. What does it mean to speak of the future? So I argue it is, first of all, an idea. It's a concept. It's a necessary concept, and one that we can't avoid having. So it's not so much a question of what's going to happen in the future, or what objects or phenomena correspond to the future. The future is conditioned by reason, it's conditioned by possibility and necessity. Yeah, so as I said, it is a guiding idea, it's a critical idea. Now, to try to make sense of it, I claim that, well, of course, the future is contested. There are all these different contested theories and philosophies of the future, both historically and in contemporary thought. But I think it's not enough just to conclude the contested concept. And of course, most concepts in social science are contested concepts. I argue that it's multi-dimensional and essentially it can be broken down into 4 different aspects. So first, I begin by saying that the future is an existential concept. I refer to Samuel Beckett's famous play, Waiting for Godot, this idea of waiting as part of the human condition. Heidegger's Being and Time is all about the future, a fascinating work about the future in which he puts forward the idea of the future as a form of anticipation, in this case, anticipation of the finality of death. But a very important one, a major contribution to existential thought and theories of the human condition. Sartre offered a counter-existential view of the future based on freedom. A further aspect of this would be hope. Kant, at the end of the Critique of Pure Reason, posed 3 questions, famous questions, and the last one was, for what can I hope? And I think that's a very important way of posing the question, what is the future? Kant is normally associated with the idea of progress, and he's always referred to by Koselleck, for example, has written much about the early modern idea of the future as the prophet of progress. But actually, I think his idea of progress is a very interesting way of thinking about the future, and that too was a major idea in the writings of Walter Benjamin. Yeah, so the existential aspect, and it's more than just existential, it's also neurological due to the evolution of the frontal lobe of the human brain. Only human beings have apparently the capacity to think in terms of the future. In fact, it could be argued, and I would venture the claim that humans think more about the future than they think about the past. That's perhaps a controversial claim, but I think it's one that I would want to defend. So the future is existential, it's a part of human historical experience, and it can't be separated from it, which is my issue with the school of long-termism. I don't have time to go into that argument in further detail. Secondly, it's clearly an epistemic category. It's a category of knowledge. It's about forms of knowing, prediction, forecasting, scenario modeling, and imaginaries. Thirdly, of course, it's a temporal category, but the mistake is to see it only as a temporal category. It's an orientation for the present. William James talked about the spacious present. Should I wrap up?
Wrap up.
Yeah, in about a minute. The spacious present, which could be just 5 seconds. There's the deep future and its relation to the deep past, temporalities. And fourth, it's a spatial concept too. Time without space is meaningless. Future time can be seen as a space in which alternatives to the present are created. And it's a space that's produced by imaginary projection. So the dimension of space must be there to feel the struggles. Yeah, so the future is a space of possibilities. Yeah, so essentially that's the core of my argument. And of course, the spatial aspect is a very good way to link with ideas in physics, above all the ideas of Einstein relating to space-time, that time and space are linked to space-time. And that's obviously a very complicated question. I've discussed it in chapter 2. So to conclude, I argue that there's a need for critical thinking about the future. The book is a contribution to critical sociology of the future. We need a theory of the future, a way to understand the idea of the future. We need counter narratives to the dominant ones. And of course, the future can be a dangerous idea. You know, the short term can be dangerous, as Jonathan has just argued, but the concern with only with the long term, the very long term, can be equally dangerous. And I think I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Anne, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I very much enjoyed these 2 books, and there's a huge amount of, can you hear me all right at the back? Yeah, there's a huge amount of fascinating material in both of them, but I just want to, I just want to focus on something that in different ways I found in both these books, which is a sense of crisis, right? A sense that that we're at a moment when many people feel that there is no future, that time is running out, or that the future is already here. And this, I mean, what I take in different ways, as I say, from both of them, is the idea of this loss of a sense of the future. Well, in Gerard's account, it encourages apocalyptic visions of end times or conspiracy views of elites controlling the world, dystopian views. In Jonathan's account, threatens to undermine the very possibilities for democracy. So if you think time is running out, you know, whether it's because of irreversible climate change or what seems the impossibility of ever arriving at a just settlement between Israel and Palestine, or your belief because that the world is controlled by powerful and secretive elites, you know, whatever. Any of those, you may lose patience with democracy. I mean, the idea of no time to lose is not conducive to the rhythms of democracy. As Jonathan says, when the future seems to be closing in, institutions organized around the idea of persistent disagreement and changing opinion start to look out of place. You know, no time to lose is much more suited, you know, to revolution or insurrection, or perhaps much more commonly to possibly foolhardy immediacy. So I was quite struck that Jonathan's analysis of the support for Trump, he sees it not so much as a kind of nostalgia for the past, which I think is one of the things that the many people, you know, have thought as kind of central in support for Trump, but actually a willingness to throw the dice and try for something, anything new, right? A kind of recklessness about the future because of a sense that who knows, you know, it's all a mess. So there are many things that one could say here. I just want to So one thing to Jonathan and then one thing to Gerard. So Jonathan's, as I say, very much focused on how these different ways of thinking about the future have enabled or undermined the possibilities for democracy. And one of the key arguments is about the prior role and then subsequent decline of the mass party of the late 19th and much of the 20th century. Mass parties which, in his reading, managed to balance an open vision of the future, which is kind of important in his argument about one of the things that democracy really needs, an open rather than a closed vision of the future, but that those mass parties managed to balance an open vision of the future in which radical transformation was possible with also the necessity for delivering more immediate short-term gains. So this was a kind of, the mass party was a future-oriented political institution, but promising to and generally able to also balance these long-term and short-term demands. And over the course of the 20th century, the situation we're now in, it's the short-term that won out, kind of what he calls an avowedly pragmatic politics, depriving democracy of agents committed to connecting immediate challenges to a deeper vision of change. And ironically, that focus on the short term engenders not a sense that, well, at least some things will be done, but it actually engenders a sense of powerlessness. You lose your sense of the future and thereby one's confidence in democracy. And I find all this a very compelling analysis, right? The curse of pragmatism and short-termism, one kind of thinks of the shameless dishonesty of our kind of current dying government, whose every action just seems designed to stymie the next government rather than do anything that, is at all supposed to improve people's lives. And, and Jonathan analyzes this, as he said in his introduction, not as a kind of, a set of bad choices by political leaders that could be corrected by better choices by better leaders, but very much grounded in an analysis of sociological, technological, institutional change, which is something that I think has always been a characteristic of Jonathan's work. But given that, it seems to me the answers don't quite add up to the scale of the problem. So you look to increased forms of political participation to re-inspire us with a sense of our ability to shape the future. Not referendums, those got a bad name with Brexit, not particularly selection by lot, which is something a lot of democratic theorists are quite enthusiastic about at the moment, because this might be good at challenging vested interests, but it's clearly not particularly good at delivering that kind of longer term vision. Really, basically, more accountable forms of representation with a strong emphasis on the better ways of being able to recall our representative. And I suppose that's my question. It doesn't seem big enough to add up to the scale of the problem that you, I think, very compellingly analyze. Gerard's work focuses much more on the contemporary sociological and philosophical literature. And I take it from what you're saying that you're drawing on this to criticize exaggerated notions of us being able to master and control the future, like the modernist utopian notion that the future will not only be better, but that it can be fully known and transformed by human will. And I take it that it's positive for you that we've mostly lost that delusion, though, as you say, there's a version that survives in the form of the techno-optimisms and, like Elon Musk combining big data, transhumanism, eternal life, space travel, and so on. But more typically, the loss of confidence in the earlier notions of mastery and control contribute, again, to a sense of powerlessness. And what I see you as doing, I mean, I'm not sure if I've entirely understood what you're doing, but I see you as turning broadly to developments in critical theory to generate alternative ways forward from this, a focus on us as future-oriented, but with a more modest sense of the ways in which human beings can indeed shape their future. And you make some pretty strong statements about the necessity for this. So one sentence, you say, a society that does not have a sense of its future is moribund. And you repeatedly refer to your ambition to produce a theory of the future that will presumably enable this. And my question to you is primarily around that, because, I mean, at a personal level, I think it's relatively uncontentious to say that there's a sense in which human beings do seem to be inherently future oriented, in the sense that we, as indeed, you and me, find it hard to manage our lives without, some sense of where it's all going, some notion of the future. Seems relatively uncontentious to say that. But in what sense do societies need a sense of the future? Or even, what does it actually mean for a society to have a sense of the future? What does it mean to produce a theory of the future? And also, how different is that ambition of producing a theory of the future from some of the earlier, now more criticized ideas of human progress? So that I suppose is my question to you. And then finally, a thought it's not really my thought, but it seems important to at least have it out there. I mean, maybe isn't it possible that we just are in a period when there is little chance of us shaping the future, when the levels of inequality and the concentrations of power around the now almost obscenely rich make it really difficult for us to determine our own future, when the sort of inadequacy of the attempts to deal with climate change really do suggest that there's no future. I mean, maybe we really are there, right? This is not really my thought, because I'm generally more optimistic than that. But I imagine I'm sure everyone in the audience must have some moments, perhaps twice a day, when you at least you think, well, maybe there just is no future, right? In which case the problem actually is very big.
Great, thank you. Kimberly, you're next.
That's a very good start.
Another moment of optimism.
Is that on?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, can people hear me? You hear me at the back over there? Yeah, okay, good. So I think I might echo some of Anne's points in my comments. I would like to just start by congratulating both authors. I failed to do this when we met earlier on, but I enjoyed both books enormously. Really, really interesting. And both served as a reminder of how difficult it is to really think about time, I think, which is something I tried to do a little while back. So I think you both do a remarkable job in synthesizing a lot of ideas and arguments in the books. The books, as you'll have gathered, they overlap in quite a lot of different ways, but they're also quite distinct. So Jonathan is very much focused on democracy and the future, and on this conundrum of needing both openness but also some degree of finitude in how you're thinking about the future in order for representative democracy to work. But within that, a lot of the discussion of different political ideas of the future overlaps with things that Gerard is discussing in his more sort of social theory focused work. So Gerard, I think, engages with a broader terrain, a very broad range of theories, and is, as Anne was saying, actually trying to work towards articulating a theory of the future. So that's a somewhat different ambition, I think, in the two books. But there is, when I was trying to sort of think about the ways in which they overlap in particular, I got this vision of the future as a balloon. So the future is a balloon and it's floating there, and it might go pop or it might go in any direction, and it needs to be tethered. It needs to somehow be brought to bear, to somehow be kind of linked or anchored in some way. And both books, it seems to me, are trying to explore possible ways of anchoring the future in a context in which that seems to be a more and more difficult thing to do. So I would say that in Jonathan's case, that anchoring, as Anne was mentioning, is through trying to go back to ways of mediating between these different extremes of openness and finitude, of a politics of calculation versus a politics of imagination, if you like. So there's a variety of dichotomies, kind of technocracy versus privatization, ends versus means, calculation versus imagination. And as Anne was saying, the political party is seen as something that has successfully, as it were, mediated those tensions in the past and needs to somehow be kind of revived in order to do so. I mean, I really loved a lot of the analysis here. There's a great thing about manifestos and how they used to be a kind of statement of future goals, and now they're just massively long and basically saying nothing. And again, going back to Anne's point, it did remind me a lot of the current sort of shenanigans with our present masters, as it were. But there's some really important stuff about what makes promising possible, what makes any kind of commitment possible, which I think links back actually to an underlying ethical sort of argument that both you and Gerard perhaps share, something about enabling the possibility of trust or of responsibility in trying to think about the future. With Gerard, that is done. You didn't really talk very much about your final chapter, as it were, your critical theory of the future in its sort of completeness, but it seems to me your tethering, your anchoring of the balloon at the end of the day is about transcendence and about learning. And it does actually go back to, very classical critical theory way of thinking. What are the presuppositions of communication, of promising, of all of those things, and that they somehow give us a way in which we can kind of pull the future back to earth. So that's my sort of thoughts on how, as it were, you're both maybe trying to deal with this conundrum of how to pull the balloon of the future into some kind of stability. The other theme that's very much shared, and again, I'm echoing some of Anne's points here, is around crisis, catastrophe, collapse, emergency. The doomsday clock turns up in both books, I noticed. And the word deadline, I'm not sure whether it turns up in both of the books, but that image of the idea of the deadline as that space, if the prisoner goes beyond, they are shot, was really echoing in my head. But I get the feeling that Gerard is maybe more convinced by the polycrisis, permacrisis kind of analysis than maybe Jonathan is. I'd be quite interested to hear what the two of you would say about that. But certainly what you're both worried about is the way an emergency mentality is permissive of different kinds of responses that are dangerous. And both of you talk about, if you like, fascist time, creative destruction, that sort of, spitting in the face of providence. And I was really interested in that, going back to futurism and to some of that early 20th century stuff that was the kind of precursor of some of the fascist arguments about newness and modernity, but it having no kind of link, but also how that then may link into how it doesn't matter that there is no truth, that everything's lying, that you just make it up, etc. It all seemed to make a lot of sense. So I'm interested in how much the two of you are invested in the kind of permacrisis narrative, but I do think you both also bring out really important implications if one does accept that narrative. So I just wanted to finish really with 3 points or 3 questions. The one to Jonathan, I've actually put it in, it's a bit like Anne's, because it's, where does your analysis leave us, is basically what I want to ask. And I think there is that sense about whether there is enough robustness in the institution of the sort of mass political organization to move us along at this stage. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you think the possibilities are. With Gerard, you have a whole chapter on kind of physics and natural time and evolution and all that kind of stuff. And at various points, you want to bring together, as it were, social time or human time and the time of nature. And I think I wasn't quite sure in what way you were bringing them together. I wasn't quite sure what lessons you were taking, either from physics or from evolutionary theory in your argument. So I could see how there was something to do maybe with the ecological crisis that was driving that element of the argument, but I couldn't quite understand how these two were coming together. And the last thing I wanted to comment on really was time and space. Jonathan refers briefly to Afrofuturism. Gerard talks a bit about antiquity, a lot about modernity. Amerindians turn up at some point. I do wonder how much this is our own existential crisis in the sense of being quite specific to a bunch of people for whom things have started to go pear-shaped in the last 20 years, who have not actually recently experienced the collapse of their civilization like other parts of the world may have done, or who are not living in alternative temporal horizons. So how much is there a generalization of what is actually a parochial problem that always affects civilizations that are dying? And it's quite likely we are in civilization that are dying. That doesn't mean that we're at the end of, it's the end times. It just means it might be our end times. And it usually takes quite a long time for civilizations or empires to die. And I think there's something about that sensibility that maybe is also worthy of interrogation here. But thank you so much for both books. I thoroughly enjoyed both of them.
Thank you. And Richard.
Okay, so I think there'll be some overlap here. I mean, these are two very different books, but I also think, as I will say after I've said a word about each of them, that there are some common themes as well. So with Jonathan's book, I really liked the way that you linked the future to the actual process of democracy, because so often democracy is seen as being a form of as encouraging short-term thinking, whereas instead you make a very convincing argument, I think, that it's built into the very process of democracy, that you have a sort of sense that there is a future, and that motivates, as you say, the whole idea of losers' consent. And that's something that we've lost with our current emergency thinking that you've examined so well elsewhere, which has encouraged a more autocratic, oh, we've got to do things now, and hence no time for democracy, etc. So I very much agree with that. I also agree with the thought that therefore we've got to somehow reinvigorate democracy. But like Anne, and I mean, in a way, of course, it's not that I've got better ideas, but like Anne, I felt that somehow the solution fell far short of your diagnosis of the problem, as it were. I mean, even though I agreed with the rejection of autocracy and the faith that you place in the role of parties, I mean, I know you've written also on recall elsewhere, but it seems to me that that is more going to drive short-termism than long-termism, precisely because it doesn't give people a chance to fulfill those pledges that they might have made. I mean, I can see a role for it as you have in the UK today, when people have committed misdemeanors that lead to them to being suspended in Parliament for a certain time. We might even say if they get kicked out of the party, you know, with Anderson now, one should have recall, as it were. But as a more general tool, it doesn't strike me as being there. And I was slightly surprised that, I mean, although what I liked about the book was that, you know, future democracy was not like, as I tend to teach it in the course I teach on democracy, as a kind of separate module, as it were. It was something intrinsic to the very nature of democracy. Some of the things that people have suggested in this area, like lowering the voting age, for example, or having a chamber which has as its roles specifically thinking about long term and the future. You didn't mention those things, and I wondered why that was. And then finally, and this is a potential link with Gerard, thinking about the tortoise on there and how your way of thinking about democracy is embodying the future, what that meant. I wondered how you'd react, or whether this is what you think, that it reminded me of Edward Bernstein's infamous phrase in Evolutionary Socialism, that the movement is everything and the end is nothing. And do you think there's a paradox aspect of that to actually think about the future? You've got to not think about the end. You've just got to think about the possibilities of as a continuous movement, as it were. So Gerard's book is an incredibly rich survey of different conceptions of the future, both in the past and in a rich contemporary sociological literature, much of which was very unfamiliar to me. So I learned a great deal from it. And it makes me a little cautious about sort of challenging your way in which you categorize some of this. But I'm throwing caution to the wind, and we'll do it. So as I see it, you want to criticize three different modes, what could be called, though you don't fully see them in like this, utopian, apocalyptic, and presentist. And I think you actually need all three in different ways, or you utilize all three. So, I mean, the utopian, you concentrate more on the dystopian than the utopian, but utopian thinking, in a way, has been traditionally a way of trying to stop time, stop corruption through an ever-present. So utopias are typically in Moore or Campanella, that they're about the organization of space according to some kind of ideal. And apocalyptic thinking, again, you tend to look at the negative end of times, but in its historical positive form, it's about going beyond time. It's thinking about the land of cocaine, what happens at the end of it's not the end of time, but it's the period where one's no longer got corruption occurring, and so there's just richness and abundance there. And both of these, of course, are religious notions of the notions of heaven on earth. But I think when you want to drop presentism, you need to invoke elements. And I found that you did do it also, that you employ presentism in this way, because you say, all right, you say we must use the future to understand the present rather than vice versa. That's what you say on page 22. But surely that's impossible. I mean, we can only understand the future through the present, and it's actually and the past, and it's actually important to do that when we think about how should we tackle climate change, and why are we in this mess already, and what would be a fair and just way of doing it. Then we have to think about the past causes of it, its relationship to colonialism, to industrial development, and the way that's occurred. And those are deeply embedded in how we conceive of that. Of course, we also bring in some utopian thinking when we think, how can we manage it in order to mitigate the effects upon it? So those become technocratic. And we also think about, what will life be like? I mean, will this be a change, produce a fundamental change in how the economies work if we move into a green future, for example? And you yourself tend to invoke these positions. So, you know, on pages 24 or 25, you give your various elements of what you think a positive theory will involve. And in part, they involve, you say, that the future is imminent in present social arrangement. So in a sense, you're thinking about the future through the present, but not using the future and you invoke the universal norms, which normative principles, which you say are products of historical evolution, but you want to use them to move forward in an apocalyptic way, shall we say, beyond time. They're trans-time notions. So I think in that sense, you too you're employing all three of the modes that you say you're rejecting, but you're using them in positive senses. You're rejecting some negative ways of seeing them, but that doesn't mean that you're not sort of utilizing those forms of thought. Both of you adopt sort of cosmopolitan thoughts towards the end. You suggest that because we've got global problems, we need to have some form of integrated democracy at the global level, and you invoke sort of Habermasian and critical notions of a critical cosmopolitanism. And I wonder if in a period where the most powerful forces, states are either already autocracies or, with the United States, moving in an autocratic direction, whether unifying political sovereignty in a single place is a particularly good idea. I also think that might be, so I think of it as a potentially dystopian end of times type of notion. I think I've been reading recently Josephine Quinn's book on how the world made the West. And she's very critical there of the category of civilization, both in the sense of the clash of civilizations, but also as contributions to a single human civilization, and emphasizes how there's always been these global interactions between different groups of people, which have been sort of mutual learning experiences, which have been, you know, very specific and particular, and, you know, produced innovation and toleration through diversity. And in that sense, the future is both that the movement is everything and the end is nothing, but it's also valuing that diversity and that experimentalism that goes on, rather than perhaps the more kind of global vision.
Great, thank you. So Gerard and Jonathan, I'll now give you a couple of minutes to respond. I would say if you can keep it shortish, so we have a bit of time for Q&A, and perhaps we'll take it in reverse order. So Gerard, if you want to start, and then we'll move to Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much for these invaluable comments, and any responses I have were going to be inadequate, not least for reasons of time. But my concern in the book is largely analytical. It's an attempt to reconstruct and make sense of different philosophies, different conceptions of the future in modern and contemporary thought. Of course, I try to go beyond that and make more specific suggestions as regards how we might think about the future. Now, I'm not talking about what's going to happen in the future, because I don't know what's going to happen in the future. No one knows. And it's not, in my view, as I tried to explain, a purely temporal concept. I said it's got 4 dimensions. So an attempt to apply to some of the concepts. Yeah, there's certainly a disjuncture between the individual, an individual sense of the future and collective ones, be they, societal or in some way collective societies or Europe as a whole or whatever. And dealing with the latter is much more difficult than dealing with the former. Now, Kimberly kind of gave you an answer, which I didn't explore in my short introduction. Now, I see the future, first of all, as I did try to explain, an idea that we can't really do without. It's part of the way in which we think, just as much as we can't do without a notion of the present where we stand and the past. And I try to argue that maybe the future is a more powerful orientation than the idea of the past, despite its dominance. Now, I think the 2 key ideas that might answer the problem that you raised. It's a good issue to raise. Yeah. So history produces true evolution, not just the individual, the evolution of the person, of biological evolution, but the evolution of societies and of institutions, what we can call immanent structures, like, for example, let's just say democracy, human rights, and other examples that we can't just simply abandon. I think these are products of societal learning, products of historical evolution. So in that sense, the future is something that comes out of the present. But also the future is a transcendent idea, not transcendent in the sense of a total break or rupture. So there's some kind of relationship between what is imminent, what has developed, what has come out of history, and what we might want to retain from that. It's difficult to argue for a viable future without some notion of democracy, for example, as in dealing with climate change, as opposed to purely technological fixes. That would be maybe an illustration of that point. And yeah, there's a kind of a bridge there between what is immanent and what is transcendent as something that is a product of societal and individual learning. Yeah, of course, yes, I'm criticizing many of these past and present currents in future thinking, but critique is always in some way a reconstruction. Otherwise, we'll replace old concepts or ones, because we have to abandon some concepts, but many of these we will have to retain in some shape or form. So there's a big interest in utopianism today, not utopianism as, in the days of Thomas More or the older utopias, and I agree that they are essentially spatial concepts, but also in the age of H.G. Wells and science fiction, there were also future projections. So I think, I think that we have to somehow reconstruct those ideas to make sense of utopianism today, which must be seen in plural terms as opposed to one singular utopia. Quite a lot has been said. Lessons from physics, at least in sociology, but also in anthropology, there's a huge interest in the future, but the dominant tendency is to retreat into the comforting zone of phenomenology, whereby future, whereby the future is some kind of a projection that comes out of human experience, how individuals see things, but that leads to too much confidence in the capacity of humans to imagine futures, and the literature in the natural sciences does offer a corrective, and I think interesting connections with time and space, which are essential to understand the future as not just only a temporal concept. I've argued it must be also conceived of a spatial category of knowledge, but that involves identifying the limitations of knowledge. And I certainly think that societies, in the context, say, of, the obvious failure of neoliberalism, which has famously been described as a society that has no alternative, that, that's the death of social life, it's the death of, it's the death of any kind of common life. And yeah, so the idea of the future is a way in which the present transcends itself. And there will be, of necessity, I think, different interpretations of the future as there will be of any idea, similarly with, say, human rights or democracy. There's no definitive interpretation of what those ideas might be. So there's no definitive interpretation of what the idea of the future is, though it could be said that it can't be totally disengaged from progress in history. And I'm not writing off progress at all. Certainly some interpretations of progress, as in the idea of, that progress, that we can calculate everything and thus know the future, or that the future, both conceptions of the notion of the future in progress is, or, for really short term, perhaps 30 years. There's a huge interest in the future. Jenny Anderson, who's here, has written on it in the 1960s and 70s, but they were mostly thinking of up to the year 2000, 30 years from now. And that's relatively easily to think of, but say, for a longer period, even 100 years, or the so-called 200-year, a generation consisting of 200 years, presents slightly different interpretation of what that might be. Well, yeah, maybe that's all I can say. These are certainly very relevant considerations, and I hope I have partially succeeded in identifying the elements of ethereal of the future. And I think that notion of the future, whatever it is the one that we can't do without, neither in individual terms nor in collective terms. But exactly how it should be interpreted is not something that I or anyone can actually do. It is an interpretive category.
Thank you, everyone, for the observations and questions, which is very stimulating. So clearly a key one, and perhaps the one I should focus on, is the thought that Anne left with at the end, that perhaps we should take seriously the very real limits that exist in the present to the capacity to shape the future in an age of crisis, of runaway capitalism, of climate change, of the things that Gimbley was gesturing towards with the concept of the polycrisis. And I think we certainly have to accept this possibility. At the same time, I think one always has to think of a crisis as the interaction, on the one hand, between material problems, and on the other, the capacity to respond to them. And what balance can be drawn between those two is always, at any one moment, very difficult to identify. It's very difficult to know in the present the extent to which the objective component of a crisis is destined to win out over that which is to do with the political agency that we bring to bear upon it. And I think almost with some type of optimism of the will, one has to ask, well, let's work with the hypothesis that we're not in that age of the presence that no longer has any type of capacity to shape the future. We have to think about what kind of democratic resources might be available to us to run with the assumption that there are actions that can be taken. Are the ones that I talk about in my book too small to respond to that? Well, on the one hand, yes, I am talking about political collectives, parties, the ways in which the future has been collectively imagined and acted upon, and the extent to which we might think of these as still relevant in the present. I think many political parties today are compound things in which there are those who are very much attuned to the future, to long-term questions, to the isms that used to animate parties of the past. But those people tend not to have power within the party. Much that is to do with the fate of contemporary parties, I think, is to do with the distribution of powers within them. And therefore, the extent to which one might pursue reforms of collective agents is exactly the question of how one can, if you like, empower those that still have a certain future orientation, a willingness to try and pursue future projects within these existing collectives, vis-a-vis those who are leaders, who are perhaps much more professionalized, much more willing to pursue different types of ends within the party as an electoral vehicle. So to that extent, my interest in the reform of parties is inspired by the idea, not the one simply replaces the decayed forms that are the residue of the 20th century, but one asks, how does one, working with what we have inherited, think about the distribution of power within these, because there are still those within them that I think are very much more attuned to the kind of future questions that I've been describing. And I talk, of course, also about transnational institutions, something that Richard touched upon. It seems to me that one of the challenges of the present, again, thinking at these questions from the side of political agency, is both the empowerment of technocratic institutions, often in the name of long-term governance. Think of central banks as rationalized as agents of the long term, precisely insofar as they are not responsive to public opinion, responsive to pressures to do with the electoral cycle. This clearly plays out in transnational politics, where I think you also find the compartmentalization of power. My point would almost be the opposite of Richard's. I think the problem of contemporary politics is often that so much power has been parceled out to different agents, whether it's particular executive agents like central banks, or whether it's the splitting of power across national institutions, supranational institutions. It's very hard to act on the future when you're only responsible for one little part of it. And any argument for, I think, democratizing the future has to be an argument for exactly, well, democratic centralism, I guess, in a brief phrase. In other words, thinking about how one can decompartmentalize power, but at the same time democratize it. And that's why, in addition to the things that I say about political parties and collectives, I also have quite a lot to say about the democratization of international institutions. In other words, places where representative democracy has perhaps never been tried. I certainly wouldn't exclude that there are other possibilities. I don't know whether lowering the voting age is necessarily a fix that is all that much more substantial to these problems, but it's certainly one that has some interest. I'm a little bit more skeptical of assemblies for future generations, which often tend to think of the future almost as though it's the stuff of agreement, of singular interest, that we might speak of the interest of future generations relative to the present, where of course it's always about which future, the interest of which future generations, of which kind of future societies that we want to bring into being. And this is why I'm always interested in those approaches that treat the future as a matter of democratic contestation, of conflict, rather than ideas of creating institutions that somehow step outside partisan conflict and almost bolt the future onto the present as a place of conflict, the future as a place of consensus. Those types of proposal leave me cold. And very finally, Bernstein, am I perhaps sympathetic? I'm sympathetic perhaps to moving away from an idea of final goals, which one perhaps finds in much of socialism and perhaps social democracy of the latter 19th century. I think one finds echoes of it in the present. The talk of transition, even in contemporary climate change discourse, is in a sense, I think, a kind of a way of thinking about the future as bookended, of critical moments of things after which one can expect a certain type of equilibrium to be restored. It has interesting resonances, I think, with ideas of transition from capitalism to socialism and the idea of final goals that go with that. So I am, again, interested in what we might learn from other strands of the socialist tradition, which are less about final goals, in some ways perhaps more sympathetic to Bernstein in that respect, but which are not just about indifference to the future and the movement as everything, but are very much about thinking about how we can bring to bear general principles, ideas, a certain level of abstraction to think about the future. It seems to me that perhaps the tragedy of the present is that we are inclined to worry about the future, but often to approach it with a desire for quantification of the future, for probabilities, for ways of disciplining the future. And if there's something to be recalled from these older traditions, and I think perhaps all the more important in an age of volatility when we struggle to quantify the future, it's exactly the importance of general principles, of isms, of indeed ideologies. That I think is something that one probably would want to recuperate from these earlier traditions.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes, which means that I think we can do one round of questions, particularly if you keep them in the form of questions rather than comments. So would anyone like to ask a question? Excellent. Great. So we're going to start here. 1, 2, and then was there a third question? And then here. Thank you. Yeah.
I had questions for comments. First one is that have you considered the question of knowledge about the future? I think of that Gerard spent time on insisting on the future as an unknowable, whereas the idea of the future as unknowable is deeply linked to the idea of sort of open futures and democracy. But I think that's a potentially highly anti-democratic idea that we don't know things about the future. And we live in a time when we know extraordinary amounts of the future, much more than any other generation. So I think that there's a difference between criticizing a determinism of the future, but that is not the same argument as to say that we can't know things. And isn't the problem of the future today precisely the kind of fracture between knowledge and political action? And I think, in fact, that has been an element in all forms of future crisis, actually, through history. It's not necessarily the idea that there is urgency in external factors and events, but thinking about the future has very often been about a link between the things that we think we know or we know about the future and forms of action. So I wonder if you had a response to that. It was a comment to both of you, actually.
Thanks. If you'll excuse kind of my generalizations a bit here, I kind of see maybe the past 200 or just 100 years as kind of a series of shifts in thinking about the future, like the late 19th century as being a time of extreme optimism about the possibility of free trade, bringing prosperity and interconnectedness to the whole world. Then, of course, sort of bookended by the rise of nationalisms and World War in the first part of the 20th century, only then to, again, emerge again in the latter half of the 20th century, a great optimism, this time, I guess, driven by financial capital and mass communications technology. And then again now, a reversion to war and great pessimism about the future. So with that in mind, I think historically that shift was driven by particular agencies. And like, for example, the sort of first optimism sort of driven by industrial capital, and then first sort of bit of pessimism being driven by the proliferation of weapons and new ideas of nationalism. I'm just wondering here, what I'm getting at is what kind of agencies do you two think can drive forward the change that we need in terms of solving, or not solving, potentially just mitigating, or yeah, better orienting us collectively towards the future? Like, is this what kind of agency do you think could bring to bear in that regard? Like, is it sort of like a political agency of a collective of people committed to a democratic politics? Is it one formed of economic interest, say of the precariat, sort of cutting across traditional blue collar, white collar distinctions? Or is it perhaps, as Kimberly sort of kind of suggested, an ethical alliance that is grounded in values that sort of are not quite political, not quite economic? Thanks.
Last question here. Really running down the clock here.
Okay, I'll keep it short. It's a question for Jonathan. First of all, thanks for the book, Jonathan. Second, so you express some kind of, I suppose, skepticism about this kind of dichotomy thinking that crisis brings forth, right? Success or failure and so on. And yet, the first parts of your book are structured around dichotomies. I mean, not crisis dichotomies, but you speak of the near and the far and so on, right? The public and the secret, and etc. And I was wondering whether you thought that this kind of dichotomy thinking might lead us to miss some phenomena that presumably we might want to account for.
Thank you very much. So Jonathan, if you want to respond first, then Gerard, and then we'll wrap it up.
Great. Thanks, all of you. The first question about expertise, uncertainty. I think I'm very sympathetic to the idea that uncertainty is a democratic problem, or even an undemocratic notion, if we treat it as a concept that we can historicize and probe. And yet its opposite is also, I think, likewise a problem insofar as ideas or hopes of certainty, or if that's somewhat exaggerated, perhaps of turning uncertainty into risk, in other words, being able to limit with some confidence how we think about uncertainty, can of course historically be an argument for expertise and the elevation of expertise of a certain kind, which is often at the expense of wider participation in politics. I think if I was trying to think about how one might tread a line between the undemocratic embrace of uncertainty and the undemocratic embrace of confident expertise understood as contrary to public opinion and politics, I guess it would be around some notion of partisan expertise, to link back to something I've been talking about. In other words, expertise that on the one hand is an effort to cut uncertainty down to size, to try and find continuities in politics, to try and find ways on which we can form projects for the future, because if it's complete uncertainty, then we can really not act politically, and we cannot act with projects of collective self-determination in mind. But we have to find some way of making that, if you like, within the scope of collectives of participatory politics, expertise that is that amongst those who share certain presuppositions, that is partisan expertise, as opposed to expertise which understands itself to stand outside political disagreement and to therefore be worthy of institutionalization in the form of technocratic institutions. So I think I agree with the way you set up the challenge, and maybe it's with concepts like this, which I think are not just nice ideas. These are things which are out there in the relationship between parties and think tanks at their best. So often they fall short, but there are elements of exactly this type of interface out there. The cycles of optimism and pessimism that you talk to, I think are possible to identify historically. I think it's actually not one of the dichotomies I talk a great deal about, because I think partly many of the interesting political traditions are always some type of mix of optimism and pessimism. I know, are socialists optimist or pessimist? They are optimist perhaps insofar as they may have a belief in progress of a better society. Of course, in everyday politics, they might be accused of being pessimists insofar as the condition of that kind of progress might be the general deterioration of social conditions to the point where some type of revolution becomes possible, and conversely that the welfare state, that ways of coping with capitalism should be understood as perhaps delaying mechanisms. So I think many of the interesting political traditions, you can look at them on one hand and say, this is just this is optimism. On the other hand, you can look at them as pessimism. It's exactly the interweaving of the two that's interesting. In terms of your question of what kind of agency, well, I think that's as I was trying to get at, collectives, whether it's parties, whether it's unions, things which are structured to outlive the individual, things which somehow express the ongoing cause that is irreducible to the lifespan of those who are included within it. Because I think perhaps one of the problems of contemporary politics and tendencies towards heroism, towards the personalization of politics, is exactly the subordination of these types of collectives intended to last towards the individuals that compose them, or individuals standing outside them. And finally, to Christabel about a general skepticism of dichotomies. I mean, the book is structured around dichotomies, but dichotomies thought of as tensions, where often democracy is to be understood as something between these two. I don't embrace merely an idea of the open future as the basis of democracy, because democracy needs closure. Democracy needs constitutions as well as revolutions. It needs things which are cumulative across time rather than a series of breaks. And so to that degree, whenever I talk about dichotomies, it's to, I guess, to open out a field of tension where there may be multiple places within that are somehow democratic, and there are also places we might say then take us outside democracy or pose problems for democracy. That's the way in which I use the dichotomies to structure the book. And if I talk about the dichotomous success or failure thinking that maybe permeates aspects of technocratic policymaking in the present, perhaps it's because it fails to occupy that space of tension between the two, but is prone to go one way or the other, prone to seek success and criticize failure, or conversely to write off the possibility of political interventions as being futile. So that's how I would think of it. Dichotomies, yes, things get left out by dichotomies, but they can be ways of capturing productive fields of tension. They go wrong when you start to valorize one side only, I think.
Well, if there's some time, I will just reply to your comment for the avoidance of any doubt. When I refer to the issue of unknowability, the unpredictability of the future, that is only to critique the naivety of the notion of the future being totally open. So it's a critique of that position, but I'm not going in the opposite direction of embracing the position represented, say, by Luhmann and his followers, that school of thought that see the future as akin to the metaphor of a horizon, the future of a horizon being that as you approach it, it disappears, and thus the future, as Luhmann wrote in a famous article, cannot begin for that reason. So that's a critical position. And on the issue of agency, I wish I had a good answer to that. It's beyond the limits of my book, but I suppose that, in the context of a situation in which most young people today no longer believe in the future, one might argue that the future ultimately resides today, perhaps for the first time in history, in young people, and that's where I think agency has to be seen. But that requires rediscovering the future as a space of possibility and as an orientation for the present.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you've all enjoyed the talk and that you will all go and buy the books. So please join me in thanking once again Jonathan, Gerard, Kimberly, Richard, and Anne.